What would you do if your parents handed your life's work to someone who never lifted a finger? I turned our dying family store into a booming $8 million brand. Then they gave it all to my golden boy brother. 8 years of sacrifice, erased with one whispered sentence over champagne. Want to know what I did next? Hit subscribe and join me in unraveling the betrayal. They say success tastes sweet. Mine tasted like lavender perfume, warm champagne, and betrayal. The night should have been perfect. Every investor at the table had raised a glass in my honor, praising my vision, my grit, my incredible transformation of a dying brand into an 8-figure powerhouse. I smiled, toasted back, played the role of the victorious founder. But then my mother leaned in, soft voice, cold fingers, eyes glistening not with pride, but with calculation, and whispered, "Logan will take over as CEO next month." I froze. The stem of my champagne glass trembled in my hand, but I didn't spill a drop. 8 years. 8 years of working double shifts, sleeping on warehouse floors, pouring every cent I had and didn't have into keeping my family's store alive. I gave up my Wall Street career, my apartment, my relationship, my health. And now they were handing it all to Logan. My little brother. The guy who couldn't run a toaster without Googling a tutorial. The golden boy who spent the last year in Europe finishing his MBA and posting rooftop selfies with hashtags like #GrindNeverStops while I was actually grinding, managing logistics, supply chains, marketing, investor pitches. Alone. I looked across the table at my parents. My father raised his glass and nodded, proud. My mother wore that navy dress she saves for serious occasions, her smile tight, her eyes avoiding mine. My gut twisted. They looked at me like a temporary captain whose ship had made it to port. Only now it was time to hand the wheel to the real heir. Bennett. A son. I wanted to scream, to stand up and call them out right there in the private dining room at Shore and Vine. But the eyes of Meridian Capital's senior partners were on me. They had just wired us $8 million. I forced a smile, lifted my glass higher and said, "To the future." I don't think anyone noticed my hand shaking. What they didn't know was that inside something had snapped. A fuse burned out. This wasn't just a corporate reshuffle. This was a betrayal written in blood and raspberry jam. As the room buzzed with laughter and dessert menus, I drifted into autopilot. Smile. Not small talk. But my brain was rewinding, fast and ruthless, pulling me back through the years like flipping through pages soaked in sweat and coffee. 8 years ago, my parents called me in a panic. The second location had failed. The recession hit hard. Harvest and Hearth, our family's gourmet preserve store, was 3 months from shutting its doors. My dad cried on the phone. I remember I was still in my Midtown office then, a VP at a boutique investment firm, wearing heels that cost more than our old register. "We're going to lose everything," he said. I could have sent money. I could have offered advice. But I didn't. I quit my job the next day. Everyone thought I'd lost it. Even Logan. He called it an emotional detour. Told me I should let it die with dignity. But I couldn't. That store wasn't just jars on a shelf. It was Saturday mornings watching my mom stir jam in our tiny kitchen, fingers stained purple, sun pouring through the window. It was the scent of cinnamon and burnt toast, my dad's bad jokes to customers, the creaky wooden sign I painted when I was 12. So I stayed. Sold my apartment. Slept in the back room. Built a website from scratch. Started a blog. A few shares turned into 1,000 orders. I pitched to local farmers markets, landed a spot on a regional morning show, created a subscription box model that changed everything. I rebranded, filled, automated, licensed. I lived and breathed that business like it was my child. Because in every way it was. And now, after 8 years of sacrifice, they were giving it away like a party favor. When the dinner ended, my parents offered me a ride home. I declined. Said I needed to walk. The cool air hit my face like a slap. I didn't cry. Not then. I walked 12 blocks to our downtown office, unlocked the door and stood in the darkness. The place still smelled like honey and cardboard. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe answers. Maybe something to hurt. But all I knew was this. I wasn't going to let Logan walk in and reap what I had bled to build. Not without a fight. By the time I got home that night, the frost in my chest had settled into something heavier, like wet concrete pressing down on my lungs. I showered in silence, let the water run too hot, hoping it would wash away the betrayal, the bitterness, the ache. It didn't. When I finally collapsed into bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember why I ever thought this company would bring my family closer. Sleep didn't come. Memories did. The first year was hell. I took over operations during a winter so cold our stockroom freezer burst a pipe and flooded the kitchen. I worked the counter by day, packed orders by night, and spent weekends at food expos trying to convince buyers that Harvest and Hearth was more than a cottage brand. I lived on expired granola bars and instant coffee. There were days I didn't have enough money for my own groceries. I sold my car, took out a second mortgage on the condo I no longer lived in. Even then, I didn't ask my parents for help. I thought they were struggling too. I thought we were in this together. Logan, he just started business school back then. Sent a couple texts now and then. Hang in there, he wrote once, followed by a thumbs up emoji. I invited him to visit. He declined. Said he was focused on his future. I didn't push. I figured he'd come around once we were back on our feet. I kept telling myself that when he saw what I was building, he'd be proud. I never imagined he'd swoop in to take credit for it. During year 2, I launched the blog. Wrote about jam, yes, but also about my journey. The risks. The recipes. The stories. Caught fire, literally. One morning, BuzzFeed Food ran a piece. From Wall Street to water bath canner. How one woman saved her family's store. Orders tripled in a week. Our tiny team couldn't keep up. I hired 3 part-timers from the local college. Mom came in twice a week to help with labeling. Dad handled deliveries on Saturdays. It felt good, like we were rebuilding something real. But even then, looking back, there were cracks. My parents never talked about equity. Never brought up ownership. They treated me like the hard-working daughter who was helping the family. And I let them. I was too busy surviving to negotiate boundaries. I told myself it didn't matter who owned what as long as the company stayed alive. I didn't realize that to them I was always temporary. A stopgap until Logan came home. By year 4 we moved into our current space. Downtown, brick walls, sleek industrial fixtures. We landed our first corporate deal with a regional grocery chain. I built our first e-commerce dashboard with a local dev firm. Every single upgrade came from my pocket. I didn't take a salary for the first 5 years. My bank account hovered at 0, but our growth graph looked like a rocket. And yet, not once, did my parents offer to transfer ownership shares. Not even when I brought in my lawyer Rachel to formalize our LLC restructuring. I asked them to consider adding me to the operating agreement. My father said we should focus on the mission, not the money. My mother changed the subject. I let it go. I was tired. We were growing. I didn't want to rock the boat. Then came the investors. Meridian Capital found us through a podcast feature. Michael Shore reached out personally. He said he believed in brands with soul. Said I reminded him of his daughter. We talked for hours. He asked for numbers. I gave him 10-year projections. He asked for a pitch deck. I sent him a 40-page dossier that included market trends, retention data, and our social growth strategy. He was impressed. You're the whole package, he said. Vision, execution, passion. That's when I should have known something was off. Because when it came time to meet the full board, my parents insisted on being present. It's still our family business, my mom said. I didn't argue. I thought they were just proud. But now I wonder. That board meeting was 3 months ago. That's when Logan started showing up again. Suddenly he was in the loop. Joined calls. Offered suggestions. Smiled politely but rarely made eye contact with me. I remember one afternoon he walked into the office wearing a tailored suit and shook hands with our CEO like he owned the place. Logan's just shadowing, my dad said when I confronted him. No big deal. I nodded. I smiled. I swallowed the knot in my throat. It's amazing how hindsight strips away all the filters. Lying there in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning like a broken compass, I realized something devastating. I'd been an employee in my own company. A glorified interim CEO while they waited for their real successor to graduate. I wasn't building my dream. I was babysitting theirs. At 5 a.m. I got up. My laptop was still on the kitchen counter from the night before. I opened our shared family Dropbox account, the one we used to store branding documents and archived invoices. Buried in a 2015 folder labeled Legacy Docs, I found it. A scanned letter. Yellowed with age. Addressed to my father from my grandfather. The founder. Carl, promise me you'll keep the business in the Bennett line. Logan is our future. That girl's got spark, sure, but a man should lead the family brand. Below it, my father's signature. And then my mother's handwriting, neat and unmistakable. She'll understand. She's strong. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Understand? I had killed myself to save this brand. To build it. To breathe life back into something they were ready to bury. And they always knew, always, that it would be Logan's. They were never planning to give it to me. I wasn't even a backup. I was a placeholder. My phone buzzed. A message from Mason. You okay? Dinner tonight. I didn't reply. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just whispered to the silence of my apartment. They think I'll understand. They have no idea what I'm about to do. The next morning, I walked into the office early before the staff showed up, before the city had shaken off its sleep. Everything looked normal. The polished concrete floors, the amber glow of the pendant lights, the scent of lemon oil and cinnamon from the test kitchen down the hall. But it all felt different, like stepping into a house you once called home only to realize you've been written out of the will. I sat down at my desk, turned on my monitor, and pulled up our legal archives. I hadn't checked these files in years. There had never been a reason. I trusted my parents. I trusted that what I built would naturally become mine. But trust is what makes betrayal lethal. I found the first document buried under a folder labeled Old IP. It was a scanned copy of our original business license from 2006, back when Harvest and Hearth was just a mom-and-pop kitchen project operating under cottage food laws. What made my blood run cold was the name on the ownership line, Logan M. Bennett. My brother was 15 years old at the time. I clicked through the next file. A notarized brand registration filed the same year, listing Logan as the sole intellectual property holder for the Harvest and Hearth name and logo. My parents had used his name to file every brand-related document. Trademark, trade dress, even our early online domain registrations. I sat back in my chair numb. This wasn't just tradition. This wasn't just them favoring the son over the daughter. This was premeditated. It meant that legally, everything I built under that brand name could be claimed by Logan if he wanted to. I opened our current investor deck and stared at the logo embossed on the first page. Harvest and Hearth Naturals. That trademark belonged to him. I had just pitched an $8 million Series B round under a name I didn't legally own. My stomach turned. How had I missed this? How had no one on Meridian's legal team caught it? Or maybe they had and just assumed I knew. That was the worst part. Everyone assumed I knew. Because who wouldn't check the name on the deed of their own house? I called Rachel. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but sharp. You're calling early. That means something's wrong. I need you to look at a few documents, I said, emailing the files as we spoke. Check timestamps. Originals. Any clause that ties this IP to me. 2 minutes later, she whistled softly. Jesus, Avery. They set this up from the beginning. He was a child. And now he's a legally recognized brand owner. This is airtight. Your parents knew what they were doing. I stood up and paced, my hands shaking. So what do I have? What's mine? Rachel paused, then said, the systems, the infrastructure, the software, the distribution model. You didn't just rebrand a jam company, you built a logistics empire underneath it. And you did that using your own capital on your own time after the brand name was already filed. That gives you leverage. Maybe not ownership over the name, but over the engine that makes it run. My heart beat faster. So if I walked, they'd lose the engine. They'd lose everything. I stared out the office window at the skyline, the sun just beginning to crawl across the tops of the buildings. That was the first moment I stopped grieving and started planning. Later that afternoon, I confronted my mother. I asked her to meet me at the warehouse. She showed up wearing that same navy dress, like it had become her corporate armor, and smiled as if nothing was wrong. I led her to my office, shut the door, and dropped the printouts on the table between us. She glanced at them and didn't even flinch. You found the filings, she said calmly. That's it? That's all you have to say? Her voice stayed even. Your grandfather believed legacy should pass through the male line. We honored that. I stared at her in disbelief. You honored a dead man's sexism by letting me bankrupt myself for a company that was never mine? You always had the drive, she said, as if that explained everything. We knew you'd make something of yourself no matter what. Logan needed a little more structure. I felt something inside me fracture. You mean he needed me to build it so he could step into the suit when it was clean and ironed? You've always been emotional, she said softly. That's why you're not ready to lead long term. Logan has the training. He understands how to scale. I laughed, short, bitter, and ugly. I scaled it. I brought it from 0 to 8 million in revenue. I negotiated deals with 3 national retailers. I created the subscription model that saved our ass during COVID. Logan knows how to run a spreadsheet. I built the damn factory. My mother tilted her head slightly. And we're proud of you. But there's more to leadership than work ethic. I wanted to throw something. But instead I picked up the legal filings and held them to her face. If you don't fix this, if you don't transfer ownership of the brand or at least share it, I walk. I take every system, every code, every vendor relationship. I'll start over from scratch and I will take every client with me. She looked at me, then really looked at me, and for a second I thought I saw something flicker. Regret maybe, or fear. But then she stood, smoothed her dress, and said, "Do what you think is right, Avery. But know this. Families that destroy themselves over business never recover." I didn't respond. I just watched her walk out, heels clicking against the concrete like a countdown. I didn't go home that night. I went straight to Rachel's office. We started drawing up terms. A contingency plan. We cataloged every proprietary system, every document I'd built. Rachel even suggested filing a separate entity, one that would own the technology backbone I created. It was a nuclear option. But I was done being the placeholder. Let Logan inherit a brand. I would take the future. I always believed betrayal came with warning signs. Missed calls, lies that don't quite line up, a lingering sense of something off. But when it happens from someone you trust, someone whose toothbrush is next to yours, whose jacket still smells like your shampoo, it doesn't come with thunder. It comes like a whisper. Like a door left slightly ajar, just enough for the truth to slip through and tear you apart. 2 days after I confronted my mother, I decided to tell Mason everything. He was the one person who hadn't failed me. At least that's what I kept telling myself. We'd been together for almost 4 years. He'd seen the nights I worked until sunrise, the weekends I skipped brunch, the breakdowns in my car when supply chains collapsed during the pandemic. He knew what this company cost me. He'd held me when I cried about not being taken seriously. He'd said, "You're building something they'll never understand." And I believed him. So I invited him over. I sat across from him in my living room, laptop open, folders stacked on the coffee table. I showed him the IP documents, the filings with Logan's name, my grandfather's letter, my parents' signatures, all of it. Mason listened quietly, his hands folded on his lap. "Wow," he said finally. "That's heavy." I looked at him, searching his face for outrage, for anger, for the kind of fire I expected from someone who loved me. But his expression didn't change. He didn't lean forward. He didn't grab my hand. He didn't say what I needed to hear. Instead he said, "Do you think there's a way to renegotiate? Like, maybe you can stay on as COO and let Logan take the CEO role for now." I blinked. "Are you serious?" He hesitated. "I just mean, it's complicated. Family businesses always are. Maybe there's a path that doesn't burn everything down." That's when I knew. Something was wrong. Mason had always been my sounding board, my partner in battle. He was the one who helped me prep my pitch deck for Meridian. The one who told me to take up space in boardrooms. And now he was telling me to shrink? To give up the title I earned? I played it cool. "You're right. I'll think about it." He kissed my forehead when he left. Told me to get some rest. I waited 10 minutes, then opened his iPad. He'd never changed his iCloud settings. It synced automatically to mine. The first thing I saw was an email chain. Subject line, Leadership Transition, Harvest and Hearth. From Mason Roberts to Logan Bennett, CC, Meridian Capital. I couldn't breathe. I clicked into the thread. The first message was from 2 weeks ago. Before the Series B round closed. Before the investor dinner. Before my mother whispered Logan's coronation into my ear like a dagger wrapped in silk. Mason had written, "Logan is the long-term play. Avery has been a great driver for early growth, but scaling requires a shift in leadership style. We believe she'll eventually step aside, especially if we frame this as a family consensus." He ended the email with, "Let me know if you want me to broach the conversation personally. I can soften the landing." My hands went numb. The next email was from Logan. "Thanks, man. I appreciate you helping with this. I know she trusts you. He trusts you. He trusts you." I slammed the iPad shut and felt like I was going to throw up. Mason hadn't just betrayed me. He had positioned himself between me and my future like a parasite in designer shoes. And Logan, my brother, had handed him the knife. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there in my apartment looking at the life I had built, wondering how much of it was mine and how much had been quietly carved out beneath me while I wasn't looking. The next morning I showed Rachel the emails. She read them without blinking. "He's not just an opportunist," she said. "He's embedded. He's been a liaison between Logan and Meridian for months." I frowned. How is that even possible? Mason's not on payroll. He doesn't have equity. He's just my... Rachel cut me off. "He was your proxy. Meridian took his word because he's been in your orbit. They assumed he spoke with your consent." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. "So what now? They think I'm on board." Rachel nodded slowly. "Unless we move fast, they'll lock this in. Logan will be named CEO at the next board meeting, and you'll be quietly pushed into a founder emeritus role." I laughed, short, bitter. Founder emeritus. That's the title they give dead people. Rachel met my eyes. "Then don't let them bury you." I left her office and drove straight to Meridian's headquarters. No appointment. No warning. I walked into the lobby in jeans, no makeup, coffee-stained t-shirt. I wanted them to see me raw, unfiltered. The woman who had built their investment target from a one-room kitchen to a multi-state operation. The receptionist looked up. "Miss Bennett, do you?" "I'm here to see Michael Shore. Tell him it's about a misunderstanding that could cost him $8 million. 10 minutes later, I was in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. Michael walked in, surprised but polite. "Avery, this is unexpected." I dropped the folder on the table. "Read." He flipped through the emails. His jaw tightened. When he finished, he looked up. "This is serious." "No kidding. I didn't know Mason was representing your position." "He wasn't. He was representing Logan. And himself." Michael sat down, rubbing his temples. "This complicates things." I leaned forward. "Let me uncomplicate it. If Logan is named CEO, I walk. And I take every operational process, every vendor relationship, every tech platform with me. I will rebuild this brand under a new name, and I will make sure the press knows exactly why." He stared at me. "You'd really do that?" "I already started." He leaned back, studying me, then nodded once. "All right. You'll have our legal team's attention." As I left the building, my phone buzzed. A text from Mason. "We need to talk." I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't respond. I deleted his contact. He didn't mean for it to go this far. But I did. By the end of that week, I was no longer angry. Anger had burned out days ago, replaced by something sharper, colder. Strategy. The kind of focus I used to tap into back on Wall Street when a deal was slipping and everyone else was panicking. The kind of mindset that wins wars, not hearts. Rachel and I moved fast. I gave her everything. Every document I'd built, every spreadsheet, app, template, vendor list, code line, and partnership contract. We created a new entity, Golden Rise Ops, a separate operations shell that would own the technology and infrastructure behind Harvest and Hearth's supply chain and fulfillment systems. The best part? It was already in motion. Quietly, over the last 2 years, I had been streamlining our backend. I didn't even realize it would become my escape route. But now it was my sword. We transferred ownership of all proprietary systems to the new LLC. The recipes, the warehouse automation, the CRM integrations, the subscription algorithm, all legally mine. If they wanted to use it, they'd have to license it. At a price I set. And if they refused, they'd be left with a name and no engine. A shell of a brand. Rachel called it intellectual independence. I called it survival. Meanwhile, I stopped showing up to the main office. I knew Logan would be circling like a vulture, waiting for the handoff he didn't earn. I needed him to feel bold, comfortable. I let him think I was retreating, licking my wounds. But I was working in the shadows, calling vendors, meeting with key partners, quietly letting them know a shift was coming. I didn't make threats. I just told them I appreciated their loyalty and that in the weeks ahead, they'd be asked to choose where they stood. Most of them already knew the answer. Because I wasn't just their contact. I was the reason they got paid on time, the one who fixed broken logistics chains during the pandemic, the one who renegotiated freight contracts when fuel prices spiked. Logan had never even met half of them. He thought leadership came with a title. I knew it came from trust. 3 days before the board vote, Meridian's legal team requested a private meeting. Rachel and I arrived early. The mood was cautious but civil. Michael wasn't in the room, too close to the fire probably, but his deputies were. They asked questions. We answered with receipts. They flipped through binders of documentation proving that nearly every operational asset had been designed, paid for, and implemented by me, outside of any family oversight. Finally, the lead attorney closed the folder and asked, "What exactly is your ask?" I looked him straight in the eye. I want Logan off the table. I want my role formalized as CEO and Chief Product Architect. I want voting rights equal to the founding shares. And I want an immediate equity correction reflecting my contribution. One of them raised an eyebrow. That's a bold demand. Bold is what got you $8 million in revenue, I replied. Timid would have let this brand die in year 2. They didn't smile. But they didn't say no. That night Logan texted me. First time in weeks. Heard you've been busy. Can we talk? I didn't reply. The next morning he showed up at my apartment. I didn't open the door. He stood outside for 10 minutes, knocking, then left a note tucked under the mat. I didn't read it. I didn't care what he had to say. His silence during the sabotage had been loud enough. Instead, I met with Rachel again. We finalized a proposal, our nuclear option. If Meridian rejected my terms or went forward with Logan, we would issue a press release. Founder departs family brand over gender-based succession betrayal. It wasn't just dramatic. It was real. And it would hit hard in every business outlet from Forbes to Fast Company. Meridian would be dragged for backing a takeover that smelled like patriarchy and backroom deals. Rachel even drafted the media contact list. We were ready. But I didn't want to blow it all up. Not yet. I wanted them to blink first. The board vote was scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. The night before, I sat alone in my apartment, sipping scotch and staring at the wall where the original Harvest and Hearth sign hung. The same hand-painted one I salvaged from the old store the day we almost shut down. I remembered how proud my dad looked when I said I'd take over. I remembered how my mom said, "You're our fire starter." I remembered how they both stopped calling me that once Logan came back from Wharton. It would have been easier to walk away. Start fresh. Let them have the brand and rot from the inside. But I couldn't. Not because I needed the title. Not because I needed to prove something. I stayed because I'd built a company that actually mattered. We weren't just making jam anymore. We were building equity for small growers. We were hiring single moms, paying them above living wage. We were teaching rural kids how to code through our warehouse internship program. This company had my fingerprints on every level. And I wasn't handing it over to someone who didn't know the recipe. So I slept for 3 hours, woke before dawn, dressed in black, and walked into the conference room like I owned the air. Logan was already there. So were my parents. Mason was not. Good. Michael walked in last, nodding politely. Let's get started. The conference room was quiet when I walked in. The overhead lights cast long shadows across the polished mahogany table, and the giant glass windows offered a panoramic view of the city. Outside, the skyline gleamed with the first rays of sunlight, but inside, the tension was thick enough to slice. My parents sat on one side, Logan next to them, his freshly pressed suit still smelling of the tailor's shop. I took my seat across from them, my back straight, my mind clear. No one spoke. Not at first. I could feel the weight of the moment settling on my shoulders, but I pushed it down. This wasn't about family anymore. This wasn't about sentiment. This was business. This was war. Michael Shore, Meridian's lead investor, was the first to break the silence. He cleared his throat, folding his hands in front of him. All right, let's get started. Avery, you've presented your case. Logan, you've been waiting patiently. His eyes flicked between the two of us, calculating. Let's move forward. Logan smiled slightly, leaning back in his chair. The same cocky grin I'd seen 100 times when he thought he had everything figured out. I think it's clear that the board has already made their decision, he said, his voice smooth. I've spent the last year getting up to speed with the company. I've spoken with all of our major investors, visited the suppliers, met with the team. It's time for me to take over the reins. I felt a brief flash of rage flare up, but I kept my face neutral. Time for you to take over the reins? I repeated, my voice even but with an edge that made the room pause. I've been doing the work, Logan. You've been doing the talking. I've been running this business, and if you think you can just walk in and pick up where I left off, you're sorely mistaken. I locked eyes with my father, who was sitting quietly, his hands folded in front of him, a look of indecision on his face. You know this is mine. You know I earned it. There was a long pause. My father's gaze flickered to my mother, who was staring at her hands, unwilling to meet my eyes. Logan's smile faltered for just a second, but then he straightened up, his jaw tightening. You're being emotional, Avery, he said, his tone condescending. This isn't about who did what. It's about who can take the company to the next level. And frankly, I'm the one who has the vision for where we're going. He leaned forward, eyes glinting. This isn't your company anymore. It never was. Those words stung harder than I expected. It wasn't the first time Logan had dismissed me, but today it felt different. Felt like the last nail in the coffin. But I didn't flinch. I couldn't. If I did, it would all be over. Rachel was sitting quietly at the end of the table, and I could tell she was ready. She had all the legal backup we needed. Every single document we had worked on in the past week was sitting in her folder, ready to be slid across the table. I didn't need to fight this with anger. I didn't need to prove I was right. I just needed to show them the truth. I've spent the last 8 years building this company, Logan, I said, keeping my voice steady. I've worked myself to the bone for this. I've bled for it. And I'm not going to let you walk in and take it all away because you think you deserve it because of some title you want. Logan opened his mouth to respond, but Michael interrupted him, holding up a hand. Enough, he said, his voice firm. He looked at me and then Logan. We've seen the numbers. We've heard both sides. But it's time for us to make a decision. He gestured toward the rest of the board members. It's a simple vote. Yes for Logan as CEO. No for Avery to retain her position and leadership. I could feel the weight of the room shift. Every pair of eyes was on me now. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. I turned to Rachel. He passed me a single sheet of paper. The terms of our proposal. The contingency plan. If they voted for Logan, the media release would go out immediately. If they voted for me, Logan would be removed as CEO and I would take over full control. Rachel whispered under her breath, "Don't back down, Avery. You've got this." I nodded. I wasn't going to back down. Michael gave a small nod and the room fell silent again. Logan was watching me, his eyes narrowed, waiting for me to blink. But I didn't. I couldn't. All right, Michael said, breaking the silence. We'll start with the vote. All in favor of Logan as CEO. Logan's hand shot up without hesitation. My parents followed suit, their motions mechanical, as if they'd already made up their minds long before this meeting began. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my face neutral. I knew the next part would sting, but I wasn't going to let it break me. And all in favor of Avery as CEO and leader of the company? I raised my hand slowly. Rachel raised hers beside me. Michael turned to the rest of the board, his eyes flicking between the ballots they were holding. The results are in. He paused, and for a brief moment it felt like the world had stopped. Then he looked up at me. Avery, you have the majority vote. The air left my lungs in a rush. I couldn't process it at first. My brain couldn't quite wrap itself around the reality of what was happening. The vote was in my favor. I had won. Logan's face went pale, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in his carefully constructed mask. He was furious, but there was nothing he could do now. My parents looked stunned, caught in a moment of disbelief. I turned to Rachel, who was smiling, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. This wasn't just a win for me. This was a win for everything I had built, everything I had fought for. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle on my shoulders. I appreciate your confidence, I said, my voice calm but firm. But this isn't just a victory for me. It's a victory for the people who built this company, our employees, our suppliers, and the communities we serve. And I won't let anyone take that away. Logan stood up too, his face red with anger. He didn't say anything. He just stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. My parents stayed silent. They didn't speak to me. They didn't look at me, but I didn't need their approval anymore. I had the future, and it was mine. The Monday after the vote, the office was quiet in a different way. Not tense, not charged, just still, like a storm had passed and left the air clean but unfamiliar. People walked a little slower. They watched me with new eyes, some curious, some cautious, a few relieved. I didn't hold it against them. Most of them had seen the writing on the wall but didn't know which side would survive the fire. That's what power struggles do, they make everyone afraid to pick wrong. I didn't call Logan. He didn't call me. I heard through a mutual friend that he'd taken a consulting job in Chicago. Something fancy. Something forgettable. My parents didn't reach out either. The last time I saw my mother, she was walking away from the boardroom with her spine straight and her silence louder than any accusation she could have made. My father, I suspect, didn't know how to process what had happened. His whole identity was wrapped in legacy, in the idea that Bennett meant something to someone beyond us. That Harvest and Hearth would be the crown jewel passed down like a family Bible. What he never understood was that I wasn't trying to inherit anything. I was building something of my own. Rachel suggested therapy. I laughed. Then I scheduled a session. It helped. Not in the dramatic, soul-cracking way the movies show, but in the quiet spaces. The pauses between my sentences where I used to bite my tongue. The moments I said things out loud that I'd only ever whispered to myself. I never wanted to beat my brother, I told the therapist. I just didn't want to be erased. We didn't talk much about Mason. There wasn't much left to say. He sent a few messages after the vote. Tried to call once. Then disappeared, probably off to charm some new founder into thinking he was a partner instead of a parasite. I let him go. No fireworks. No revenge. Just absence. Sometimes that's the sharpest ending. 3 weeks later we rebranded. Harvest and Hearth stayed, but the wordmark changed. Cleaner, bolder, stripped of the rustic script that had once felt cozy but now felt nostalgic in the wrong ways. We launched a new product line, Reclaimed Roots. Jams, spreads, and teas inspired by forgotten recipes, family kitchens, and food histories that never got written down because the people who made them were too busy surviving. It wasn't just a pivot. It was a declaration. In the press interviews, I kept the story tight. We're honoring our past while building something new. Most reporters didn't dig deeper. A few did. One journalist from Fast Company asked directly, "You were nearly replaced as CEO. What changed?" I smiled. I did. Behind the scenes, we doubled down on what mattered. Fair trade partnerships, direct-to-customer innovations, community investment. We hired our first in-house tech lead, a brilliant developer from Detroit who'd grown up making syrup with her grandmother. I gave her full authority to build out our digital experience from the ground up. She named our new order management system Phoenix. I didn't ask why. I already knew. At home things were quieter too. The space that Mason used to occupy stayed empty. I didn't fill it with new people or distractions. I just let it be. Grief needs room even when it's grief for someone who's still alive. Some nights I still thought about the moment my mother leaned in with that smile and said Logan would be CEO. How gentle it sounded. How final. How devastating. I replayed it like a scene I hadn't been cast in, watching myself from above. Shocked, smiling, unraveling in silence. But each time the memory faded faster. Each time I came back to myself a little more whole. On the first real day of spring, I visited the original store. It had been turned into a co-op cafe last year. The wooden sign I'd hand-painted when I was 15 still hung above the counter. A little cracked, a little faded, but still standing. I ordered the raspberry jam toast, sat by the window, and watched a mother braid her daughter's hair while they shared a pot of chamomile tea. The owner recognized me. She asked if I wanted to leave a note in the community journal. I hesitated. Then I picked up the pen and wrote. Nothing we build with love is ever truly lost. But that doesn't mean we have to give it away. I signed only my initials. As I walked out, sunlight hit my face and I realized I wasn't carrying it anymore. The weight. The anger. The need to prove something. All of it had been heavy for so long I forgot what light felt like. But now I knew. Light wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was peace. And peace I had earned.